Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show Podcast. Narrated by Portillo. Today's episode, The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy, and dauntless, and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. And all these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the halls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western, or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenance of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had finally ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But, in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure, they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then for a moment all is still and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterward fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay. And the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness, and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
I hope you enjoyed that story by Edgar Allan Poe. Welcome now to After Talk, at least that's what I like to call it, where we talk about the history, the significance, and the meaning of the piece. The Masque of the Red Death first graced the world with its spooky narrative when it was published in 1842 in Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine. Allegedly, the story only earned him $12, and even in his time, that wasn't a lot of money for such an original and classic story. Its original name was the Masque, Masque of the Red Death, a Fantasy. Some speculate that the edit to Masque puts more focus on the masquerade ball rather than on the costumes of the story. Like this was the debut entrance for the Red Death to an otherwise isolated society. Many have said that when writing this story, Poe was inspired greatly by Horace Walpole's novel, The Castle of Otranto, and that novel is widely and historically considered the very first Gothic novel ever. The Red Death seems to be similar to other diseases prominent in Poe's day, although not identical. During the 1830s to 40s, America began to have waves of typhoid fever, typhus, cholera, and influenza. With the way that Poe builds the reputation of the Red Death in the story, it also seems like he could be comparing it to the Black Death. And let's not forget that Poe's birth mother, his adoptive mother, his wife, and his brother all died due to tuberculosis. He couldn't even catch one break. It's really sad. Maybe Poe took some inspiration from the diseases surrounding him to write about this fictional one. Another possible inspiration could be what is called the Bal d'Ardent, which was a masquerade ball held for French nobility by Charles VI of France in 1393. During this dance, scholars believe the dancers were dressed as wild men and depictions of demonology, and it was held supposedly to satiate Charles's tendency to suffer attacks of insanity. That ball burned down. And whether or not this story was inspired by that event, there is another short story we'll read that was more likely to be inspired by it, called Hop Frog. Now, I'd like to address the fact that I did research something after recording. I have to apologize because I thought that the object, brazier, was pronounced brazier, but a brazier is a bra. So the story does not contain braziers giving off light. Those are braziers. I'm so sorry about that. I had no idea beforehand, and then I checked after I'd already recorded the episode, and it was too late to go back. The Masque of the Red Death has been adapted to a surprising 3 films. The first came out in 1964, starring Vincent Price as Prince Prospero, which I was able to find for free on YouTube, so go check that out before they take it down. This film was directed by Roger Corman. Prince Prospero is seen as a lot more cruel to peasants and judgmental of the nobles. He burns a peasant village for voicing their objections to his rule, and at another point tosses precious stones to the nobles on the dance floor and muses about how they scramble for them like hungry men for breadcrumbs. Roger Corman came back for a second film in 1989, this time as a producer, and it was directed by Larry Brand. The third film was a slasher directed by Alan Birkinshaw. It has also been adapted into a 2007 play and even its own Dungeons & Dragons campaign. You'd be surprised to know how many adaptations of this story get around the comic world, too, from Marvel Comics and Charlton Comics and Dell Comics to Dark Horse Comics. Now, making the music for this story was, once again, a lot of fun. I hope they're all fun, but I read this story, and what I really got from it was that sensation that the Red Death was lurking around the entire time, waiting to pounce on all of the masqueraders, the fear that they felt remembering it was still out there every time the clock chimed. So I wanted the music to have that ethereal feeling to it, lying under the surface. I also improvised a little bit because I couldn't find a decent clock sound. But I did find a toy glockenspiel while making the music, and that's what I used for the chiming of the clock. It also played the blood motif in a higher key, which I thought brought it all more together in making it sound like the Red Death was encompassing and surrounding the characters. The symbolism of this story is vast, and some of it is obvious. For example, the clock that rings through the halls. That could represent time wearing away and death coming for all despite their nobility or wealth, getting closer with each passing hour. It's unclear whether or not Prince Prospero is young or old. I would wager he's fairly young because he seems very arrogant. He supposes that he can avoid death by closing the walls all around him and nobility. He taunts the specter at the ball dressed like the Red Death, and he even approaches to kill this stranger. It seems the text is inferring that Prospero feels himself to be invincible, invulnerable to sickness or to death, especially in his safe castle. There's plenty of food, wine, colors, the vibrance of life that is usually associated with being young. The characters of nobility in the story seem to revel in their immense amount of wealth as well, but end up dead, maybe hinting at a message similar to "you can't take it with you." There's also relevant symbology of the 7 rooms of the palace, each a different color, which represent the progression of life. And maybe that's something that Prince Prospero wanted built specifically in his castle, or maybe it's just how Poe wrote the story. But we go from blue, representing birth, like I would think of the color baby blue, to purple, youth, to green, our adolescence, orange, our adulthood, white, old age, violet, most likely you're either close to death or death is kind of lurking around you, and finally to black and scarlet, death. The rooms are also organized from east to west, maybe symbolizing the cycle of the sun rising in the east to set in the west. In conclusion, I think this story should serve as a lesson that we don't have all the time in the world. Obviously, it's also a sort of warning against those who revel in material things and hoard their wealth, that death is still coming for you, and perhaps at an accelerated rate, because Poe was very poor throughout his lifetime, and I think that seeped into his writing. This story seems especially relevant in our time for reasons which you, I'm sure, understand, and to pretend that we do have all the time in the world, or that we are invulnerable to the passing of time or even death itself, is pure folly. The most valuable thing we have as humans are our relationships. Our relationships are the things that make this life worth living, no matter how long that is. I hope you were entertained by this episode of the Poe Show podcast. As always, I appreciate that you're here. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share it, give the podcast a good rating, subscribe and follow, recommend it to a friend, because the more, the merrier. And if you're interested in supporting this podcast and gaining access to exclusive bonus content, then click the link in the episode description or Google Patreon/thepoeshowpodcast.com. That link will always be in the episode description. If there are stories you'd like me to feature on this podcast, classic horror stories that you would love to hear, then please email poeshowpod@gmail.com. That's poeshowpod@gmail.com, and suggest them for future episodes. I'd love to learn about more classic horror that I can help reveal to the world. You can also email if you have any questions about the process of how an episode is made. If you want to know something more about the reading, the music, the editing process, a specific episode, send an email and I will address it in the next episode. Thank you for listening. And as always, I'll see you in the next one on the Poe Show podcast.